A standard car engine takes in air from the atmosphere to provide the oxygen required to burn the fuel, but for some, this can be a bit of a drag. So to give their machines a boost, a supercharger can be fitted to compress the air and force it into the engine under pressure to give you a bigger bang for your buck. And as we've got the green light, let's go ahead and take a quick spin through how it's made. Production starts with the supercharger's aluminium housing. A press applies several tons of pressure to install 2 steel ball bearings into an aluminium plate. These will enable the supercharger's rotors to spin, compress air, and force it into the engine. A steel cap is then bolted over each bearing, before steel dowels are inserted into holes along the perimeter of the plate and fully seated with a press. The dowels will align with receiving holes on the adjoining housings. A steel ball bearing is now pressed into a plate that will form the front end of the housing. This bearing will enable the supercharger's input shaft to rotate and by doing so, spin the rotors. A rubber lip seal is then pressed onto the top of the bearing to keep oil in and dirt out. A retaining clip is then applied to hold the seal in position and is seated into its groove using the press. Next, the input shaft is inserted. Its flanged end will protrude from the front of the supercharger, where a belt and pulley will rotate it so that it turns the gears which spin the rotors. A computer-guided mill machines each rotor from extruded aluminium. Once both rotors are ready, sealant is applied to one end of the supercharger housing. The rear plate containing the 2 bearings for the rotors is then added. The plate is secured to the main housing using socket-headed screws which are tightened with an air driver. The first of 2 rotors is now installed on the other end of the housing, inserting its shaft into the first bearing in the newly attached rear plate. The second rotor is then installed, inserting its shaft into the second bearing in the plate. The second rotor lies perpendicular to the first, which allows the spinning rotors to capture air at the top of the housing, compress it, and force it downwards into the bottom of the housing. The housing is then closed with another plate, which also contains bearings for the rotor shafts. However, on this end, the shafts protrude beyond the bearings, so that they can receive gears. The housing containing the input shaft will be attached to these, which, driven by the belt and pulley, rotates the gears to spin the rotors. The supercharger is now ready for a performance test. A dynamometer assesses the ratio of speed to airflow to ensure the rotors are compressing air efficiently and are outputting the required amount of thrust. If the rotors pass the test, the aluminium housing is then hand-polished to a gleaming finish. A key tool in setting up the supercharger is a fan-shaped part known as a feeler gauge. It ensures that the distance between the rotors is correct. If the rotors are too far apart, they won't compress the air adequately, while if they're too close together, they can jam. When the supercharger is installed, a pulley is attached to the end of the input shaft, before a belt is attached to the pulley. The other end of the belt then loops around the engine's crankshaft pulley to connect the supercharger to the engine's rotation. And now, ready for some instant acceleration. Pedal to the metal and go. Glad those aren't my tyres.